Wisconsin. I am also the Vice President of State Affairs for the National Taxpayers Union, which is the oldest taxpayer advocacy group in the country. And I come to this role after 16 years of service in the Wisconsin State Legislature, in the State Assembly, and then in the State Senate. In 2018, I ran for the US Senate in my state. And while I did not win, it was an amazing opportunity that I will always be grateful for. And it gave me an opportunity to meet amazing individuals, not only in the state of Wisconsin, but all across our great nation. It's actually during my campaign that I had the good fortune of meeting Sylvie Legere and learning about the Policy Circle. And obviously I was a little busy on a campaign to get involved in Policy Circle, but after the campaign, I quickly got involved, and I'm very thrilled that we have developed the program in Wisconsin and other states. And we welcome people not only from Wisconsin, but other states this evening. So joined tonight by Julie Grace. She is also a member of our Wisconsin Policy Leadership Council. She is a policy analyst at the Badger Institute, where she researches and writes on occupational licensing, which we'll be talking about this evening, and criminal justice policy. She has been with the Badger Institute for 2 years, and before that, she worked for Wisconsin's former Lieutenant Governor, Rebecca Kleefisch. Julie is no stranger to the world of public policy, and me, it is incredibly heartening to see this young generation of women stepping up into important leadership roles in the world of policy. Welcome, Julie.
Thanks, Leah. This will be fun. I'm excited to be here.
Well, you know, you and I share a common bond in that many years ago, I was a research fellow for the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute.
Yes.
Is
now the Badger Institute. Yep.
Now the Badger Institute. And never in my wildest dreams did I think, when I was working as a research fellow there, that I would end up getting into the world of public policy as an elected official. So, Julie, keep an open mind.
Oh, gosh.
I believe you.
That's probably what you said at that time, but for now I'll say not my cup of tea.
Never say never. Well, tonight's discussion is incredibly important to all Americans, and we thank you for joining us, and we hope that it will spark your continued interest not only in this topic, but in policy, the policy circle in general, where you'll have an opportunity to learn about a wide array of public policy issues affecting our nation, affecting our states, and even our local communities. So let's begin. The ravaging effects of the coronavirus have presented state lawmakers and governors with colossal public health policy challenges. So how in the world can there possibly be a silver lining to the pandemic under these circumstances? Well, in their attempts to ensure adequate care for all of those who are suffering and affected by this life-threatening disease, policymakers have eased a variety of burdensome regulations and obstacles to maximize the role of our country's army of healthcare providers. And therein lies the silver lining. You know, I remember early in my years in the legislature, we were moving a bill to allow mental health care providers to do online virtual visits. And there was such a shortage of mental health care providers at the time, and also a huge stigma attached to mental health that made the notion of virtual visits very appealing. It wasn't easy to get that bill through the process, but it finally happened. It shouldn't take a pandemic to get people to open their minds to finding innovative ways to provide greater access to care, but that's exactly what has happened. So tonight we will be discussing some wonky terms like universal licensure recognition, telehealth, telemedicine, third-party certification. What we hope to do, Julie and I, is to make these inside baseball terms make sense to you so that you will have an awareness and can challenge the lawmakers in your state to advocate for common sense policies. So let's start with the work that you have been doing, Julie. You've recently written quite a bit about universal license recognition. Tell us a little bit, explain what it is and how this last year has really illustrated why it is good public policy, not only for Wisconsin, but other states as well.
Sure. So universal license recognition is the wonky term here. Sometimes people just refer to it as license reciprocity. But I want everyone to think a year back and remember at the beginning of the pandemic when we would see all those headlines in news articles about the nurses at that time traveling to New York to serve people who were when COVID started. Eventually nurses traveled everywhere across the country. But in order for them to actually practice in New York, they had to get a license there to practice. So universal license recognition is basically just that. It's one state recognizing a license from another state, and allowing someone to easily receive a license to practice there. But this did not just start during the pandemic. The pandemic really caused it to explode. But in 2018, Arizona actually passed the first universal license recognition law in the nation. In its first year, I have the numbers here, they accepted about 1,200 applications. And that's not just for healthcare professions, that's for other licensed fields like cosmetology or the trades, behavioral health, doctors, nurses, physical therapists, every person who has an occupational license. If they want to attain one in Arizona, they can get one easily as long as they are licensed in another state and they don't have any disciplinary hearings or infractions against them. So basically, it's one state recognizing another state's license. I just want to tell one quick story because I think this illustrates the need for this so much. So I guess not last year, 2 years ago, I wrote a story on a woman named Megan Thompson who moved to Wisconsin from California. She said she was searching for a lower cost of living and a higher quality of life, which I always love to say. And she moved here with her family, and she was a licensed clinical social worker. She had a master's degree. She was practicing in California for years. She was actually a teacher at a local college, so she was qualified enough to teach people entering that field. She moved to Wisconsin, and it took her over a year for her to get her license to actually just work and earn a living once she moved to Wisconsin. That's not acceptable. Wisconsin was one of the states that made this policy temporary, and we had a lot of healthcare workers who came here during the pandemic, but as it stands right now, it's only temporary. Last year, Governor Evers did sign a law that allows for reciprocity for military members and their spouses because they move a lot, obviously. But as it currently stands, unfortunately, Wisconsin is not one of the states that has universal license recognition.
Well, and we're going to make sure that everybody who's listening will let their elected representatives and senators, if you're here from Wisconsin and even in your own state, to know how important this is. I put a link, I had happy fingers, put links to your articles that you've written on this, Julie, but I think I did it twice. So I apologize. It's in the chat column. People can look through and see some of the articles Julie has written on a variety of topics that she'll be talking about today. It's interesting when you were talking about this, it occurred to me, the pandemic in particular affected different states at different times. And there was a need for a lot of people in one state when other states didn't have quite the need. And that's why it's really important to have the ability to be able to pick up. And there are people who love to do this in the health. It's in our blood. We just want to go and serve and help in areas of need. And that's why, while it's great that this can happen during the pandemic, it would be nice if we could have this on a permanent basis. I thought about this also. What about out-of-state healthcare providers for telemedicine? Can they practice virtually across state lines?
Sure. So when I was doing my research on this, I guess a few months ago, I was shocked to learn that a doctor across the border in Illinois or Minnesota could technically not, pre-COVID, could technically not serve a patient via telehealth in Wisconsin. That was another temporary policy that changed. And I actually submitted an open records request to our Department of Safety and Professional Services on this. And for about 6 months, I haven't updated it, but we accepted over 500 applications of doctors who wanted to practice telehealth here. A lot of those were in neighboring states, which makes total sense. But others were from across the country who figured, hey, if I can serve someone in Wisconsin, a lot of mental health professionals as well, if I can sit in Florida or Ohio or Indiana and actually serve someone in Wisconsin via this new technology that everyone's using called telehealth, why not? And so a lot of people from other states, not neighboring states, also applied for those telehealth temporary licenses. Once again, this is another policy that as of now is not permanent, but we would of course like it to be.
Are there any other non-fiscal policies that you would like to see made permanent, things that happened during the pandemic?
Yeah, so when the pandemic first hit, there were just so many deregulatory actions that state after state were just implementing. And it was like all it took was, well, unfortunately, what it took was a pandemic, but things that people would have wanted to fought for years, just all of a sudden in the blink of an eye, we had Republican and Democratic governors just signing. So some of the policies in Wisconsin that we followed a little bit were expanding some scope of practice laws for physician assistants and some other medical professionals. A kind of a fun one that I enjoyed following was allowing bars and restaurants to actually deliver alcohol, which I would have thought in the state of Wisconsin would have already been a law, but it was not. I think there is a bill in the legislature to allow for that now. And then another area that we also saw, and this wasn't as relevant in Wisconsin, but certificate of need laws were also another area, which basically is, Leah, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's when a hospital can actually limit the number of people or the number of beds that they can have. So there were just a whole ton of deregulatory actions. It was almost hard to keep up with them. And many of which, and I think the reason that this is also interesting is because we have a year now of showing how well that they've worked. And so it kind of makes the case for us pretty easily that a lot of these should be made permanent.
I totally agree with you. So Julie, if you could wave your magic wand, are there policies that you would like to see enacted as it relates to, or what policies, other policies would you like to see enacted as it relates to a licensure?
Sure. So if I could wave my magic wand, I think temporary license recognition or universal license recognition, that just seems like an easy fix for the current state that we are in. I mean, I think maybe a handful of states, maybe a dozen, already have that. And so that's working, and that's great for people who are looking to move here and get a license and get to work and start making a living. But I also look at kind of broader licensing across states and across professions. And I would love a world where we could think about licensing in just a totally different way, which is if a profession or an industry or whoever, the public wants to regulate a profession, what we see time and time again are we rush and legislators rush to the most restrictive type of regulation, which is an occupational license. What I would love to see in a ideal world would be if we could look at pairing the public safety risk to the type of regulation needed to actually keep the public safe. And so for some professions, and many of the healthcare professions, an occupational license is totally legit. They should be licensed. But for many others, especially a lot that might be licensed in some states, but not others, we might want to start thinking about, can we require registration or certification, or do we just let the market do its thing? So if I could wave a magic wand, I think I would kind of reshape the way that we think about regulating certain industries and certain professions.
Well, I
So,
think you and I are on the same page, and I'll bit more about that later on as well.
yes,
Thank you
yes,
so much
exactly.
for your
Yeah.
input and all that you've written on this topic.
Yes, of course. And so now we're going to shift here a little bit. And Leah got to ask my questions and in my ideal world, magic wand, and we'll get there for her as well. But Leah, you've written a lot on these topics as well, specifically about the role of pharmacists being used as vaccinators during the pandemic. And my understanding is that pharmacists have already been given the authority to administer vaccines in 50 states. So why is this additional legislation required?
Well, you're absolutely right, Julie. And let me add that the reason for widespread acceptance in all 50 states is because pharmacists are highly respected members of the healthcare team. And I say that as someone who is a registered nurse, and I've worked alongside pharmacists. So while they can administer vaccines in all 50 states, there are barriers that prevent many pharmacists from being able to administer all vaccines. There's actually a patchwork, as you may want to describe it, a patchwork of state pharmacy practice laws. So what does that mean? It means that each state has different guidelines for pharmacists, and even within each state, the types of vaccines that are offered in one pharmacy may be different than the ones that are offered in another pharmacy. And maybe you've even noticed this, some of you who are following this, that you've wanted to take your family in for vaccines, childhood vaccines, adult vaccines, and you find out that the pharmacist in your neighborhood only will do the adult vaccines and not the children's vaccines. And that can be very frustrating. So the reason this is, most states require written protocols between the pharmacist and a partnering physician. And each physician who signs off on these protocols may agree to different vaccines depending on what their comfort level is. So ultimately, what that results in is it puts patients, and in this case, consumers, in a position of having to weave their way through a maze of options, having to get on a phone and finding out if they can take their family to one location to get all their vaccines, or are they going to have to go to several different locations? And that's a problem that can be easily and should be fixed by lawmakers across this country.
Then I'll put that ball as a former legislator back in your court. What type of legislation would you propose to solve that problem if you were back in the state Senate here in Wisconsin?
It's pretty simple. It's get rid of the protocols, plain and simple, get rid of the protocols. 8 states have actually done this, and Wisconsin did it recently. And had I been in the legislature, I would have wholeheartedly supported this legislation that allows pharmacists to administer FDA-approved vaccines without a physician protocol, as long as they are following CDC guidelines for the vaccines administration. So besides Wisconsin, the other states that allow this, that are ahead of the curve, California, Alaska, Oregon, Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico, Louisiana, and Maryland. It's a great step forward, and it will go a long way toward ensuring uniform access to not only the COVID-19 vaccine, but other vaccines. But, me, I always liked to be bold when I was in the legislature, Julie. So I could take this even a step further. And if I could be in the legislature right now, I would also tell my Wisconsin legislative colleagues that they should push legislation that would eliminate the need for waiting for the CDC guidelines. And a bill could simply say that pharmacists may administer any FDA-approved vaccine, and once it comes out, and not wait for that added piece of the CDC guidelines. So right away, I could see the faces of people who are listening. They might be thinking, oh my gosh, that's scary. We shouldn't really do that. But let me tell you a little bit about historically what happens it's rare that the guidelines that the CDC come out with after the FDA approval are any different. They're virtually the same. But what does happen is it may take 6, 9, 12, 18 months between the FDA approval to the CDC guidelines that come out. That is a lot of wasted time that people are waiting for vaccines that are very important that they could need rather quickly. Sorry, I'm getting so excited that I'm stumbling. California, believe it or not, we don't always look to California as one of those leader states on policy, on good public policy. They passed this type of legislation for the COVID vaccine, but only the COVID-19 vaccine.
Cool, interesting. Well, it's good to hear that Wisconsin is at a little bit ahead of the curve, though, like you said, there's certainly more that we could do. Are there any other professionals who could be given the authority to give vaccines, especially now when everyone needs one?
Well, there's actually discussion in our home state of Wisconsin to allow dentists to be part of the crew of vaccinators. And I think it's a great idea. They're hearing the legislation right now in, I think, the state assembly. It's not like dentists don't know how to use syringes. I think we've all been in the chair where we had that syringe put in our mouth. I think they could easily put a vaccine in our mouths, and I think it would be good public policy, because especially when there is a pandemic and we don't want this to happen again. We hope this is 100. None of us have to experience this again. But, you know, right now, there are lots of people who are trying to get vaccines. And if you don't have enough people to actually put those shots in the arms, it can be troubling. And this would be one way to increase access to the vaccine for more people.
Yeah. So in your current role as VP of State Affairs at the National Taxpayers Union, I believe you recently testified in the Georgia legislature on this specific type of telemedicine policy called ocular telemedicine, which I'm not familiar with. Could you describe that a little bit and tell us why it is so important?
Sure. It's another one of those wonky words I was talking about earlier. There's all kinds of language in our professions. I found that in the field of nursing and medicine as well. So it's pretty simple. This is an example of a new innovation that can provide access to services that normally would have required people to get in their car, especially if you live in a rural area, travel great distances to receive care. So there are now online vision testing services, which allow for an online prescription renewal for contact lenses or spectacles, glasses. Now, let me just say very emphatically, this is not for the original prescription, but this is for renewal of an existing subscription. Here we go, an existing prescription. This is entirely safe, and during the online screening process, an individual has to answer a variety of questions and go through various steps. And if there are any underlying health risks or problems that are flagged during the online testing, the individual is not able to continue with the online testing, and they're directed to see their eye care specialist in person. So these safeguards are important. And as a nurse, I find those safeguards to be perfect and exactly how they should be. And they give me peace of mind that this technology is safe. So it's currently allowed in 37 states. But unfortunately, what has happened is that some states are moving to outlaw these services. And sadly, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we move on, it's caving to political pressure. Lawmakers caving to political pressure from lobbyists representing certain strong groups like optometrists, like contact lens manufacturers. These opponents see this innovative technology as a threat to their market share. And Julie, you and I both believe that free markets are important, and it allows for innovation, and it allows for greater access and lower cost in healthcare. And that's why there are folks that don't want to see that. They want to maintain their control, and they don't like to see other people moving into their market area. So while you said it, you were confused and you hadn't heard of it, you probably, if I said the name Warby Parker, that would ring a bell. That Warby Parker.
Have Warby Parker glasses.
There you go. Invisalign, which gives people the ability to have braces. That technology is available as well. So during the height of the pandemic, there were a lot of people, because of the pervasive lockdowns or just fear of going out in public and being exposed, a lot of people stayed home and were unable to get their prescriptions refilled. And they were left with no option if they could not do that, but to have to wait it out with glasses that may have been broken or running out of contact lenses. And I mentioned cost as well. It should be known that the average cost of an in-person prescription renewal is $185 compared to $40 for an online screening. So again, this is also a cost savings, which, of course we would support, wanting to greater access at a lower cost.
Right. Well, especially just with the boom of telehealth over the past year, I think a lot of people had no idea what it was until maybe May, when they needed to do a checkup or whatever. They, like you said, were afraid to go out. I actually have some numbers in front of me that I'll just read because I have them. So the percentage of adults age 50 to 80 who use telehealth rose from just 4% in May of 2019 to 30% a year later. And like, that's just one poll. Every single poll, again and again, shows that the use of telehealth is it boomed this past year. My box of contacts is running low. And so now I'll know to use a fancy word next time I want to try to get an updated prescription. Okay, so we've talked a lot about universal license recognition, as well as some specific telemedicine policies. So now, Leah, I'm going to ask you the same question that you asked me, which is that if you could wave your magic wand and really make any other policy permanent as it relates to licensure, what would it be?
Well, I have a big wish, and one that many people might find controversial, so hear me out. But while I believe universal licensing, which you have been pushing and advocating, and I am completely in the same camp with you, it is the right direction. And sometimes we do things incrementally to get what we need and what is in the best interest of the public. It still puts government directly in control of who can and cannot practice, how various professions can practice. Lawmakers are literally making decisions on rather complex practice issues, healthcare practice issues that they may not know a lot about. And I'm not saying that in a demeaning way. When I was in the legislature, people came to me with questions about healthcare policy. Likewise, I went to my colleagues on issues that related to dairy farming. I didn't have a dairy farm in my district, but yet I had to make decisions about dairy farming. So, if there aren't many lawmakers who have a healthcare background, this is, can be problematic because you're really trying to educate an entire caucus on both sides of the aisle on an issue that people may not understand. And if you ask any lawmaker who has served on a health committee, Republican or Democrat, they will tell you that these, what we call scope of practice bills, are their worst nightmare. Mm-hmm. They're asked to settle disputes between a variety of healthcare providers. These bills are what we call fence me in bills or fence me out, where one profession doesn't want another profession treading anywhere near their field of practice, even if they're fully trained and capable to do so. So let me give you an example. There may be, we've gone a long way in the friction between nurse practitioners and medical doctors, but we see it crop up in other areas. There are laws that pit or bills that pit physical therapists against athletic trainers. And these are very nuanced And people in the healthcare arena may understand it, but people outside of the healthcare arena may not. I remember years ago, there was a bill, and I'll spare you the details, but it was really bad public policy. And at the time, there were two nurses in the legislature, a senator, a Democrat, myself, I was in the state assembly, and we completely agreed this bill was bad. But unfortunately, the group that had lobbied for it did a very good job of convincing a large number of lawmakers that this was good policy, and the bill passed through. Even though the two of us were screaming at the top of our lungs, we even went to Governor Doyle, Democrat governor at the time, asking him to veto the bill, and it didn't happen. So decisions are made based on who lobbies the hardest in a situation like this, who has the most money to give to politicians, and not on what is in the best interest of the patients or best patient care. So licensing gives lawmakers power over what types of clinicians are allowed under the law, number of hours of training that they have to have, the range and scope of practice. And studies have shown that what this really does, it's a stranglehold that stifles innovation and progress in healthcare. It creates barriers to practice. It inhibits the upward mobility of healthcare professionals. And ultimately, as you and I both know, it increases the cost of healthcare. So what would be my magic wand alternative to that? Alternative to direct government licensing is a system where states recognize what are called third-party organizations that certify the competence of healthcare professionals. And a great leader in this area, and I've given a link to a study by Shirley Savorny and Michael Cannon, both of the Cato Institute, and they've written extensively about this. And how it would work under this scenario is that accredited institutions in various specialty areas would define the standards of practice and certify the training of individual clinicians. Let me give you an example. In the state of Wisconsin, I am registered as a nurse, but during my years of practice as a nurse practitioner, I was certified by my national nurse practitioner, pediatric nurse practitioner organization, professional organization. They determined the standards. I had to take their test. I had to take X number of continuing ed credits every year in order to keep up with the standards that the profession believed were up to the highest standards. And that is what we're talking about here. Under this kind of scenario, it takes politicians out of the decision-making process and takes them away from being influenced by lobbying groups or any group that has a stronger voice or a larger muscle. So again, it would be my big wish list. It's going to take some time to get people to that point, but it does present, the current situation does present a lot of barriers that this scenario would get rid of. So
I love that idea.
Okay, well, let's work on it together. Maybe
let's do
together.
it.
Okay, well, we've talked a lot here tonight, and now we hope that there are some questions from those of you who have chimed in, and hopefully we've demystified a little bit about the topic and made you start thinking about the sky's the limit here for what can be done and what should be done as we move beyond the pandemic. So are there any questions? And I'm going to ask Julie to man the question box here because she's younger and she knows the technology better than me. There has to be one. Don't be afraid. Somebody has to have a question.
Well, ladies, this is Judy.
Hi, Judy.
I'm behind that policy circle picture there. I am in the state of New Hampshire right now and moved here in November. And when I was watching the news recently, they are allowing in Massachusetts firefighters to administer the vaccine. So when you were talking about that, it made me think, oh my gosh, right? Like if you know how to, so what's your feeling about that? Like that was pretty cool. Like if you need to have this vaccine go out and you need people to, I didn't even think about the fact that there, there wouldn't be enough people to actually be there to shoot the vaccine into somebody's arms. So what about firefighters doing that?
I'm all for it. Look, if they're going to be first responders and get to a scene and perform CPR, I certainly believe that they're capable of giving a vaccine. And I would wholeheartedly welcome that. That's a great idea.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say, anybody, if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself and just talk. There's only 7 of us on the call.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Yeah, in regards to telehealth, what are the factors that are resisting this? Is it coming from hospital systems, or what is the argument for not doing that? And what are the main factors that are trying to prevent that from happening?
Do you want to go first, Julie?
I will start, and I'm sure you'll have a few to add. With regards to the licensing, like I said earlier, you can't just easily, until this past year in many states, you can't just easily transfer a license from one state to another. And so the incentive for a doctor in Illinois or Ohio to get licensed in Wisconsin, when maybe they'd have to do more training and hours, when they're already they shouldn't have to, they're already perfectly capable, they're serving patients in another state. But that process is just unnecessarily difficult. A doctor is probably a bad example, actually. But for many other professions, the process is just difficult. I do know as well, when I was doing some research on this, that there is a debate among insurance companies, and Leah, I don't know if you know anything about this, as to whether telehealth visits should be reimbursed at the same rate because they're still using the same amount of time or not. I'm not too familiar with that issue, but I do know that there was some pushback, not pushback, but like a roadblock or a little bump in the road there amongst policymakers as well. Leah, I don't know, any other thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, what telemedicine does and all of these ideas, it just takes people out of their comfort zone. This is the way we've always done it. And so people don't want to think that there's a different way. It's threatening one profession to another. In the case of the eye exams, as I mentioned, the optometrists really don't like that because they'd rather have you come in and get your eye exam, because then they can walk you right over to sell you the glasses right there and the contact lenses, as opposed to you getting this online and choosing where you want to go. I mean, they make it difficult for you to even take your own prescription where you want to go. People should have choice. Choice creates more options. Competition lowers the cost. And so, there's just a entrenched status quo, which we're trying to shake up. And, I commend the lawmakers in Wisconsin and across the nation who are starting to say, let's do this permanently. If it's working now, let's continue doing this. So, but it takes people becoming aware of it, which is why Julie's been writing about it, why I've been writing about it, and why we're excited that Policy Circle gave us this opportunity to talk about this, because it gets talking in their own circles. And the more that you're talking about it, the more likely you are going to have an opportunity to prevail upon your own lawmakers in your states.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks, Darla, for the question. Anyone else? Well, I guess we covered everything, Julie.
Guess so. Yeah.
Well, at the very beginning of the chat, Julie put our contact information for both the Badger Institute, National Taxpayers Union, our personal email addresses or our professional email addresses. So feel free, if you think of something after the fact, or you read through the articles and things that we have included in the chat column and you have questions, please reach out to us. The very fact that, we have seen an easing of restrictions during the pandemic is almost an admission that government regulations act as an impediment to healthcare access and that they drive up the cost of healthcare. And I think that's pretty revealing. And common theme from our discussion this evening has been removing regulatory layers, getting rid of red tape, getting rid of bureaucracy, getting government out of the way, and letting the private sector, innovation, and ultimately market forces guide public policy versus government dictating a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think that's what Julie and I are hoping that you will come away with tonight. It's interesting that the Trump administration coined the vaccine development process as Operation Warp Speed. Now, having served in the halls of a state legislature, I can tell you it didn't often work in warp speed. And I would oftentimes quip with constituents when they would come up to the Capitol to see a day in session. And I would say, you are here to see government in action. You decide if that's a word or two words. So, we don't often think of the words government and warp speed as going hand in one sentence, but ultimately that is what happened. Government got out of the way and unleashed the innovators to do what they know best, and that is to do so in an unencumbered fashion. If it's a good thing to remove those barriers during a pandemic, then it should be a good thing all the time. Don't you agree, Julie?
100%. And I just want to make sure there are 2 hands raised. Do we have more questions before we end real quick?
Very good. Let's do it.
I have a question. This is Catherine.
Okay.
Leah, what you said about the lobbyists having the loudest voice, the most money, and that's what would sway the vote ultimately. How can we make our voices louder?
That's a great question. And I don't want to say that it happens all the time, but there are times when you will see that it happens. I know I've been in that position. Various groups support you, and they will do a fundraiser for you. They'll hand you a check, and I know, and many lobbyists know this about me. I would say I appreciate your support, and we may agree and we may disagree, and I hope that you understand that there will be times I may not be taking a position that your organization stands for. So I think you need to elect individuals who are going to be strong and firm in their convictions and are not going to be afraid to stand up to the special interest groups. But then I also think that as individuals, you have power too. And I think we sometimes forget how important it is to pick up a phone, make a call, write a letter, send an email to a lawmaker. We read these things, and people often ask me, what influenced you the most? And I have to tell you, it's the personal stories, to hear from individuals that tell me how a proposed piece of legislation is going to affect your family, how it's going to affect your business, as opposed to sending a form letter. And a lot of times groups that are, for or against bills will have you sign a form letter, and that's fine. But I'll be quite honest with you, I paid far more attention to the individual stories when people really poured out their hearts and explained to me exactly what happened. And I learned that before I even got into the legislature, because I was concerned about education in my daughter's classroom. And I went to the Capitol, had never done it before in my life. And I had done it, I had taken a group of parents to the Capitol to testify and to talk to lawmakers about an issue. And it was a group of 20 of us. And none of us had ever done this before. But we had passion, and we had a list of about 10 bullet points about an issue that we were really concerned about. And we met in the center of the Capitol one day, and we didn't have appointments. And I remember handing out this sheet of paper with 10 bullet points. And I said, okay, knock on doors. We don't have appointments. You may not meet with the legislator. They may be in a committee hearing or on the floor, but their staff will be there. Take a short period of time, be passionate about the issue, leave the information, and know that you advocated on behalf of your children. Well, lo and behold, this particular issue that we were concerned about moved the dial. And I will never forget getting a call from one of the lawmakers who said, I don't know what your parents said or did, but you made a difference. So you can make a difference that way as well, and find other people who are concerned like you are and band together as a voice. And it's often very refreshing to hear the voice of the people, as opposed to, hate to say it. And if there's anybody who's listening who's following this webinar and they're a lobbyist, you have the tools and the resources to get your message across in a way that average citizens don't. And sometimes that voice of the average citizen really rings through loud and clear if you take that time to get that personal story out.
Thank you so much. That's very, very helpful. I'm getting more involved in my community, and that's very helpful.
Great. Does Darla have another question? Or is her hand still up from before?
Sorry, it's still up. I apologize.
Well, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you all for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us this evening. If you haven't already, please join the Policy Circle Network with a membership. And I know that we put the link to the Policy Circle organization there. Click on the join button. We would love to have you join us. On behalf of Julie, myself, the Wisconsin Policy Circle Leadership Council, and Policy Circle in general, thank you for joining us. We look forward to future discussions. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.